The boomers turned to video games to inflict their generational trauma upon their children, as easy as NES Works 1, 2, 3. Surprisingly, this week's games have more than the word wolf in their titles in common. Specifically, both serve as a collective couch trip for middle-aged Americans to work out their collective trauma and issues about the Vietnam War. Now, granted, America didn't suffer from nearly as much trauma about the conflict in Vietnam, technically never a legal war as if such distinctions matter, as the Vietnamese did. Nearly 60,000 American kids were tossed into the military's meat grinder and never came back, a tragically massive number. But then something like 3 million Vietnamese civilians and soldiers died, with millions more displaced or imprisoned once America failed to uphold the objective it threw all those kids' lives away for in the first place, and the communist regime rolled in from the north and seized power. There's no happy ending on either side, besides, I suppose, the fact that Henry Kissinger is finally deaded in hell. This loss of life and the US military's generally disastrous efforts in Vietnam were a big part of what made the 1970s such a bummer of a decade, and a big part of what the 80s pushed back against. Ronald Reagan became president largely on his promises to make America feel good again, and a big part of that involved coming to terms with that whole mess in South Asia. And fittingly, for a country that elected a Hollywood actor to sit in the White House and tell us how cool we are, America processed the Vietnam War during the 80s primarily through the lens of pop culture and media. Television and toy products like G.I. Joe, whose early members largely consisted of Vietnam vets, inspired by writer Larry Hama's own experiences in the service, made the Army seem fun, cool, exciting. Rousing television commercials turned the Air Force and Army themes into calls for action. And echoes of Vietnam plastered the silver screen, either directly through films like Platoon and Rambo, which litigated the country's involvement in Vietnam and treatment of its soldiers while lionizing the individual heroes who served there, or through works that reprocessed the dynamic of the war through metaphors. You know, the low-tech Ewok uprising of Return of the Jedi, or the Space Marine Squad's desperate holding actions in Aliens. It's difficult to explain just how much the fallout from Vietnam permeated the US media landscape in the 80s, from trashy schlock like the A-Team to Oscar bait like Full Metal Jacket. Needless to say, the NES was hardly a haven from these rehabilitation efforts. Despite being a platform targeted at kids who weren't even alive when Saigon fell and the US pulled out and abandoned its allies in the democratic South Vietnamese government to the tender mercies of the North, we've already seen several Vietnam-inspired games on NES, including some based on the aforementioned Platoon and Rambo, as it happens. And these certainly won't be the last games we'll see resulting from the collective American hangover about Vietnam. But Airwolf and Operation Wolf certainly do represent the tonal inconsistency and at times, corporate insensitivity about the whole thing. Now, neither of these games actually takes place in Vietnam, but both clearly exist in the shadow of that conflict. In the case of Airwolf, the connection is made totally overt in the source material. A television show that ran from 1984 to 87 on CBS, and then later the fledgling USA Network. In Airwolf, a veteran military pilot named Stringfellow Hawk steals an advanced attack chopper prototype as part of his effort to learn more information about his brother, whom he believes to be a missing in action prisoner of war in Vietnam. Some episodes of the series involve further forays into Vietnam, which in turn involves some incredibly awful, even for 40 years ago, yellow-face casting. So, by that standard, maybe Airwolf for NES isn't so bad. It's a terrible video game, one of the worst we've seen on NES to date, but at least the only two humans we see on screen, Mission Commander Archangel and a female hostage who keeps getting captured while wearing the same lacy nightgown in the tradition of Marion Ravenwood, don't involve any offensive makeup. I'm afraid that's all the good news I have to share about Airwolf. Everything else about it really calls into question that whole Nintendo seal of quality thing. I mean, sure, we all know now that the seal of quality really meant this publisher paid Nintendo to manufacture its carts. But back in the day, we were young and naive enough to think it actually meant, this game is good. Surely Airwolf's failings were simply the imaginings of our feeble, incompetent child brains. But no, this game sucks hammers. On paper, it seems like it could be a good thing. It essentially combines the combat and mission format of Top Gun with the premise of Choplifter. In other words, every mission revolves around rescuing hostages, and it largely plays out through a first-person viewpoint in which you gun down enemy aircraft with either your nose cannon or a limited number of lock-on missiles. As you progress, you slowly gain new abilities, such as the option to lock on to ground-based foes. Apparently, the final mission even involves acquiring nuclear technology. I say apparently because I can't imagine anyone ever reaching the final stage. Even if the game weren't preposterously difficult as a combat sim, its design is so clumsy and hostile to players that no one could possibly want to complete Airwolf unless it was literally the only video game they had access to. And even then, I think that's the point at which you just swear off of video games. But I prefer not to deal in reckless hyperbole, so I'll lay out the actual shortcomings of this floundering attempt at light entertainment. For starters, Airwolf differs from the likes of Top Gun or Afterburner in the fact that you pilot a combat helicopter rather than a fighter jet. Of course, Sega's superscalar shooter Thunderblade also puts you in the cockpit of a chopper. Really, though, the only meaningful attempt that game made to engage with the shift from sweep-wing jet to rotary vehicle was to slow the pace of the action for some tricky top-down sequences. Airwolf, to its credit, does at least stop to ask what it means to control a chopper. Unlike in jet-based games, you can come to a complete stop, control your forward velocity, and turn on a dime. This would be great if the game actually did a reasonable job of presenting all of this, but it really doesn't. For starters, the limited button selection of the NES controller means that the face buttons are dedicated to your two weapon options, while the D-pad controls your direction. To accelerate or decelerate, you need to press and hold the select and start keys. We haven't really seen that many games that attempt to use these mushy little rubber chiclets for anything besides pausing or making menu selections. But Airwolf dares to turn them into action buttons, something we will see from time to time on NES, and always a disaster. And even then, that interface choice honestly wouldn't be too much of an issue if not for the fact that Airwolf does such a terrible job of actually relaying the nature of the eponymous chopper's movement in-game through 360 degrees of motion and change its velocity between a dead standstill and hundreds of miles per hour. But from your first-person gameplay viewpoint, you never actually experience any of this. The backgrounds do a terrible job of relaying a sense of velocity. Whether you're puttering along at 5 miles per hour or 500, the sky and ground don't communicate speed, and land emplacements, enemy vehicles, or ATC towers always seem to approach at the same rate regardless of your speed reading. And nothing in your combat viewpoint gives you any sense of your current heading. Airwolf can pivot freely through a full range of motion, but incoming fighter planes and ground emplacements alike don't move around the screen in any relation whatsoever to your current compass heading. Perform a 180-degree about face, and a plane approaching from the side will still more or less appear in the same spot on screen by the time you're done. This makes evasive maneuvers effectively impossible, but worse, it makes navigation by any means besides the on-screen minimap an exercise in futility. And the process of navigation is already enough of a pain in the ass. Every mission takes place within the bounds of a map, and the moment you cross the map's perimeter, the mission ends, provided you've rescued all the hostages. Otherwise, the game forces you back into the combat zone, flipping the chopper's orientation 180 degrees. That's not the worst thing in the world, until you enter maps where you need to navigate through tiny straits. Because the cockpit view does absolutely nothing to convey information about your heading, or orientation, or the boundaries of a level, these sequences can be profoundly frustrating as the game bounces you back and forth between invisible map markers while scolding you for your dereliction of duty. And that's not even taking into account the fuel mechanic, which causes Airwolf to burn through gas at a prodigious rate. So fast, in fact, that in some stages it seems impossible to actually complete a mission, since you need to navigate around the map to such a degree that you burn through your reserve long before you have time to stop off at a fueling depot. which of course you'll usually find so far out of the way that it chews through half a tank just getting there. Somehow though, none of this is quite as bad as the Choplifter-inspired side-view sequences in which you need to land Airwolf between obstacles in order to collect prisoners of war. There's almost nothing to these sequences, since the screen doesn't scroll, enemies don't attack, and the wind speed indicator doesn't actually seem to have any bearing on your chopper. You just need to feather your gas as you descend and collect the hostage. The only danger you face here is not noticing the perspective change quickly enough and crashing into the scenery. Generally, then, you'll just return to the standard action view immediately after landing, but occasionally you'll see a portrait of the passenger, the aforementioned lingerie lady, who will offer a quick quip. I don't know who this woman is, or how she keeps getting abducted in these enemy combat zones, but based on her attire, I can only assume that she suffers from a severe form of somnambulism and keeps sleepwalking into the DMZ. Anyway, terrible game, which admittedly is not a surprise coming from Acclaim, whose output will plummet radically in quality going forward now that they've shifted their business model from importing overlooked Japanese titles to funding the development of all new games. And here we have another notable NES landmark to go along with the besotted decision to use select and start as action keys. Our first Western developer that isn't Rare. Acclaim tapped an Australian microcomputer developer called Beam to design and program this version of Airwolf. Were we still in 1987 or 88, Acclaim almost certainly would have just paid to license Kyugo Bokei's Famicom port of the Airwolf arcade game, a perfectly tolerable horizontal shooter. But not the new Acclaim. No, they decided to go their own way and fund a shockingly unpleasant game in the Flight Sim mode, a game that ended up making F-16 Fighting Falcon for Master System look like a masterpiece. I don't want to come down too hard on Beam here. Although the studio's extensive work on Commodore 64 made them quite familiar with the MOS 6502 processor, a variant of which powered the NES, this was their first project ever for a console. I suspect that goes a long way toward explaining why Airwolf turned out the way it did, such as their terrible decision to assign forward motion to the select key. For creators accustomed to the more capacious architecture of the C64, the NES must have been a real downgrade in terms of capabilities and interface. Maybe that's being kind. I don't know that Beam ever delivered anything for NES you'd classify as an unqualified success, although some of their later projects like Star Wars and Nightshade weren't too shabby. But those only came after the studio had 3 years of experience with the NES under their belt, which we're going to find is a real disadvantage for Western studios in general on NES. By 1989, Japan's third-party studios had been developing for Famicom for 3, 4, even 5 years in some cases. In the US, Europe, and Australia, though, everyone except Rare and its subcontractors were just getting started with this hardware after the console's stunningly successful 1988. That's a huge experiential head start to catch up with. And to be honest, I don't think we'll ever see a Western-developed NES game that stands up to the best Japanese output in terms of tech or design. Well, except from Rare, but they were basically the HAL of the West. Based on Airwolf, Beam seems to be positioned to be, the Micronics. The other critter in this two-wolf pack thankfully stands up to scrutiny a lot better than Airwolf does. It pales in comparison to the original arcade version, but at least it's tolerable. Operation Wolf made its debut in arcades in 1988, another unapologetic video game riff on Schwarzenegger's Commando, a film that used America's various military adventures in Latin and South America during the 80s as a sort of collective catharsis for all the kids left MIA in Vietnam. That is to say, Schwarzenegger's protagonist John Matrix mounts a one-man assault on a foreign country to bring home a group of hostages. This the same year that Sylvester Stallone's John Rambo returned to Vietnam to rescue American POWs. Like I said earlier, America was definitely working through some stuff. And instead of paying for therapy, we all just paid $3 a head to go watch oiled-up bodybuilders pretend to put things right all by themselves. Operation Wolf then puts players in the role of Matrix, albeit with the serial numbers filed off, as he blasts his way through 6 stages of jungle and military compound in a highly condensed action movie, complete with a narrative arc: infiltrate, seek intel, rescue, escape. Developer Taito did a damn fine job of tapping into the American collective consciousness with Operation Wolf, but its theme alone didn't make it one of the most popular light gun games of all time. Taito employed the mounted gun style of light gun shooter here instead of allowing the use of a cable-bound pistol a la Duck Hunt, anchoring the weapon to the center of the arcade console and allowing players to aim freely around a pivot while looking down their weapon's iron sights. Plastic sights, whatever. It's all well and good and well established in arcade history, but what made Operation Wolf stand apart from its predecessors was its technical finesse. The game absolutely filled the screen with hostiles, as enemy soldiers ran, rolled, and leapt onto the screen in a constant flurry of action and threats. On top of that, the arcade hardware sported some beefy graphical capabilities, which meant that rather than gunning down tiny little guys, you were facing off against huge, detailed enemy soldiers. And this was never more evident than in the bad guys who appeared suddenly at point-blank range to direct short-range melee and knife attacks at the screen. Close-range fighters took up a massive portion of the screen, filling about 20% of the combat window, and typically appearing suddenly out of nowhere, banking on the fact that players interacted with the machine by focusing intently down the gun sights in order to make those soldiers' appearance a powerfully effective jump startle. Combine that with the player's rapid-fire submachine gun, which could chew through both enemies and the player's ammo reserve, the need to use precision targeting to shoot and collect power-up icons while avoiding non-hostile battlefield factors like medics and children, and the alternate fire switch that allowed you to launch rockets at large-scale armored foes, such as helicopters and APCs, and you have yourself a damn fine arcade shooter. Operation Wolf was a massive hit, and it saw multiple sequels while inspiring tons of similar games. Operation Thunderbolt and Operation Wolf 3 shipped soon after the original, and 90s arcades were lousy with Operation Wolf-style shooters like Terminator 2 and Revolution X. And of course, the original Operation Wolf made its way to just about every home system worth a damn. Of these many home conversions, the NES port sits squarely in the middle. As you might expect, it fares a whole lot better than the MSX or ZX Spectrum versions, but it doesn't manage to be even a fraction as convincing as the TurboGrafx 16 or Amiga releases. And what can you expect, really? The NES was never going to be able to recreate the multi-layered, oversized enemy sprites of the arcade game. Even tapping into Predator's Big Mode wouldn't have done the trick. On top of that, the NES Zapper light gun was not designed to function like a fully automatic weapon. While accurate, its target sensing system pairs trigger pulls to on-screen flashes in order to register hits and misses. I suppose it's possible that the console might be able to read the fact that the player hadn't released the Zapper trigger. The constant flash that would be required to feed rapid-fire targeting information to the game would be incredibly harmful to players with sensitivity to strobing lights. Not that anyone cared about such things in those pre-Pokemon days, but a brief flashing screen during gameplay is one thing. A constant stream of flashing would make anyone miserable. So Operation Wolf for NES does away with the arcade game's two most compelling hooks: the ability to spray the screen with constant submachine gun fire and the presence of massive screen-filling foes. But it does reasonably well with what it has to work with. It is not, however, a great light gun shooter. In fact, I'd say it's pretty damn bad on that front. The Zapper simply isn't designed to support the rapid-fire assault that Operation Wolf demands, and on top of that, the game doesn't seem great at reading your shots. I tried 2 different Zappers on 2 different CRTs, and they both worked horribly, generally failing to register what should have been successful hits, and often failing to acknowledge shots at all. On top of that, the Zapper's lack of a secondary fire button means that in order to fire rockets, you need to hold the B button on the controller while firing. This isn't the first NES game to require the use of a controller and D-pad, but somehow putting it to use for alt-fire feels a lot more cumbersome than using it to pan the screen. Maybe because Gotcha was designed around the 2-hand setup, while Operation Wolf doesn't feel as though it was. Thankfully, you don't have to play with a Zapper. You can play Operation Wolf with a standard controller alone, firing with A, launching rockets with B, and guiding a targeting reticle around the screen with a D-pad. This isn't perfect, and between the imprecision of the D-pad setup and the fact that you can fire far more quickly with the A button than with the Zapper trigger, means you burn through ammo fast in this mode. but you can adjust the speed of the gameplay to dial things back a little, which makes a big difference. And while this port barely resembles the arcade game on the technical front, it does recreate the scenes and challenges of the coin-op pretty accurately. Soldiers run, roll, and leap into view here too, and while they look a lot less impressive, they're every bit as aggressive. You have to face down assorted vehicles and do your best to harvest ammo clips and rocket refills as you're able, while doing your best not to shoot friendlies, or worse, to cause them to be caught in the detonation of a rocket or dynamite power-up. And just as in the arcade, Operation Wolf on NES hinges on your actions in Stage 5. There are 5 POWs in the prison camp, and you need to save them all if possible. This is more easily said than done, since they spend a lot of time running across the screen to safety, during which they're vulnerable to friendly fire. You also need to be mindful of enemy assassins who make a beeline for the POWs and will kill them if they manage to catch up. You'll know when you've let a POW die because they ascend to heaven as a little angel. A little touch of Sega style here on NES. Operation Wolf's NES port actually gives you different endings based on how many POWs you save. The president greets you with differing degrees of friendliness based on your rescue count. Save all of the prisoners and you're given a warm handshake. Save none and he turns his back on you, probably contemplating sending you to The Hague. You know, back when Americans were allowed to be tried there without sparking an international incident. It's a respectable attempt at adding some substance to a game so dearly lacking in style. Credit to this version belongs to a developer called Dai Seisakusho, a subcontractor that frequently worked for Taito and Bandai. To my knowledge, this was the only Dai-developed game to reach the US. The rest of their catalog remains stranded in Japan. Even Arkanoid 2 for some reason. Operation Wolf doesn't strike me as a particularly essential NES release. More like an inevitable, if ultimately ill-advised, conversion of a hit arcade game. But while this port doesn't add anything of value to the mix besides some nice cutscene visuals, it does at least get the job done. For a thankless project like this, I suppose that's good enough. Unbelievably, Airwolf got not 1, but 2 previews in Nintendo Power, which is twice as much coverage as Adventures of Lolo. Yes, the magazine really loved its defunct television shows. On the other hand, Operation Wolf actually got a decent-sized write-up, the first we've seen in a while. The January-February 1989 issue of Nintendo Power featured a 4-page Operation Wolf spread, followed the next month by a tips section note on the criteria for seeing its various endings. Still no cure for that generational trauma, though. Next time on NES Works, a game that makes you want to run and hide lied.